This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the podcast, this is the 9th episode in our special series on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You're diving into the second part of the episode that we're doing on the Nakba. It's rather long, so I decided to break it up into kind of 3 sections. This is the middle section, where we're going to talk about basically the beginning of the Civil War in November of 1947, and we're going to follow that all the way up to basically March 1948. If you haven't heard our previous episode, where we kind of laid out some of the context, we talked about the UN partition, and especially some of the reactions to it, I would really, really recommend hit stop right now, go back and listen to that first episode on the Nakba, because it will help you understand a lot of the context and a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. Okay, when we last left off, we talked about the idea of Britain giving up the mandate in February 1947. We talked about the United Nations trying to kind of figure out this unsolvable problem of how do we, deal with the future of the area? How do we decide on how much of a Jewish state to create, if we just create one at all? How do we decide to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And what we saw is that after an investigatory commission in the summer of 1947, the United Nations voted on November 29, 1947, to partition the territory between a mostly homogenous Arab state and a Jewish state that would have a slight Jewish minority, but would have about 400,000 Palestinians or Arabs as their kind of minority population. Now, this isn't the place to get into an extended discussion of the United Nations, but one of the major criticisms that it often receives is that it's pretty ineffective at solving crises. It has a number of kind of functions that it carries out. A lot of the job that it does in terms of helping refugees, in terms of science, in terms of promoting cross-cultural contributions and exchanges, right? The UN does a lot of things well, but conflict resolution is one that it really kind of tends to struggle with. And one of the big problems here is that when the UN makes a decision, it has little ability to enforce that decision. I'm recording this episode on June 10th, 2024. Right now, there is talk of trying to have the UN vote on a ceasefire resolution to kind of force the Israelis and Hamas to come to some sort of ceasefire. But the reality is that the UN has no ability to enforce that decision. The United Nations has no army to send. They have peacekeepers that countries will make available. But as we'll see later on when we talk about the 1967 war, those peacekeepers are not really that effective, right? They're there only so long as people want them to be effective. And then once you get someone like a Ratko Mladic from the Bosnian context in the 1990s that decides, I don't really care about the UN peacekeeping mission, then basically those guys are not effective. They're not really combatants. They're just there to be in the way. And once someone decides they don't care if they harm UN forces, then the UN tends to lose effectiveness, or the meaning of those troops tends to go away. The lone exception to this would be maybe the Korean War in the early 1950s. Anyway, to bring all this back to Israel-Palestine, in late 1947, the representatives of the various nations at the UN vote to create a certain reality on the ground in Palestine through this UN partition. And whether you believe that was fair or not, it was at least designed to solve the crisis. It was the idea that we're going to put these two communities, we're going to stake out where they can each have sovereignty, and maybe from that point onward, they can begin to resolve their differences. They can begin to work together. We'll put them in a customs union. The Jewish side is going to pay a subsidy of £4 million a year to the Arab side to help them out economically. Maybe we can build something here. other than the fact that the Arabs living in Palestine, at least their political leadership, rejects this proposal, the other fatal flaw here is that it's dependent on the British to basically do the job of carrying out the work of transition. In other words, the British held the mandate, the British had maintained most of the infrastructure, had control over most of the money that the government had, collected the taxes, that sort of thing. And so in order to transform the UN partition vote into a reality, the British are pretty fundamentally important in terms of making that happen. The British, however, had no interest in this transition. Even though they had turned the issue over to the United Nations, the British don't really care about resolution for the sake of resolution. The British are trying to figure out, how do we curry favor with the Arab states so that we can get good deals on oil? I think a lot of times when you read the literature from this period, especially there's this kind of assumption that the British are really supportive of Zionism, and that's certainly true of certain British politicians, people like Winston Churchill, who one could argue are kind of true believers. But as a whole, British foreign policy is not pro-Zionist or anti-Zionist or anti-Arab. British policy is whatever is good for Britain at the moment is what we're going to do. So they have no problems changing policy, tactics, positions. A lot of it depends on British politics and the needs of the British state or polity in the moment. At any rate, as I said, in this case, the British are not interested in helping the partition because the Arabs are opposed to it. The British are also, to be fair, dealing with this Zionist insurgency going on in 1947. British soldiers are being murdered. They're being kidnapped. There's terrorism. Between May of 1945 and October of 1947, 127 British servicemen were killed and another 331 wounded by Jewish organizations such as the Lehi and the Etzel. If you're British, why on earth would you want to reward these groups for using violence? There is also a question of practicality here. If you are the British and you are watching what is going on the ground, the presumption is that millions and millions of Arabs who are hostile to the idea of a Jewish state in the region are going to win the long-term war against these several 100,000 Jews in Palestine. Why would you invest precious resources? Right, this is 1947. There's a series of crises going on in Britain itself. There's actually going to be rationing of certain foods that weren't rationed during World War II in Britain because the economy is so bad, because the winter harvest is so poor. So if you only have limited resources, why are you going to bet on the losing side? To use a kind of historical analogy that'll make sense to Gen Xers, if Mike Tyson is going to get into a fight with somebody, why would you place a bet on the other guy? You know, maybe you got some extra income laying around, but you're not going to bet against Tyson. What are you, crazy? And so basically, the pragmatic British thinkers are thinking this is going to end quickly. The Arabs are going to overwhelm and destroy the Yishuv. Let's join the winning side. Let's get what's best for Britain. Another element of British policy not to be left out here is that the British, I mentioned that they're not really pro-Israeli or pro-Arab. They kind of vacillate back and forth. One of the few steadfast commitments that they have in the Middle East is their relationship with King Abdullah of Jordan. Abdullah, if you will recall, was one of the brothers from the Hashemite dynasty. Basically, as they're setting up the post-World War I era in the Middle East, the British will install Faisal as the prince or the king of Iraq. And Abdullah, his brother, will basically take over what's known then as Transjordan. Today it's known as Jordan. This Hashemite regime, especially in Jordan, there's not a real clear historical or ideological reason for its existence. Its existence is because the British wanted it to exist, essentially. And so Abdullah is always very careful to kind of curry the favor of the British. He's the kind of British man on the scene in the Middle East. And so they especially want to support him. Well, how can they help their ally Abdullah of Jordan? One of the things that dawns on not just the British, but on Abdullah himself, is that Abdullah could step into this power vacuum in the Middle East. Abdullah could annex parts of Palestine or all of Palestine. Abdullah reaches out to the Yishuv and floats this constantly. Hey, what if I took over Palestine and you guys can live in autonomous regions, or I can give you certain rights, I can give you certain power, I can be your patron, I like you guys. So the British policy is, what can we do to help Abdullah, is essentially the core of their policy. The UN partition is not working in that effect. It's not going down that path. And so the British, even though they turn this over to the United Nations, even though the United Nations passes this resolution, the British actually decide not to support the commission. They don't allow the commissioners to come initially. And they try to just kind of muck things up a little bit. As a result, rather than taking measures to set up a new civil administration, rather than trying to figure out a structure so that the transfer of power can kind of proceed efficiently and, most importantly, non-violently, the British essentially allow the Mandate government to collapse without a replacement. The Treasury is essentially emptied and taken back to Britain, with the exception of one £300,000 sterling transfer to the Supreme Muslim Council in February of 1948. The Supreme Muslim Council is the kind of religious representative of the Muslim community in Palestine. It is heavily influenced by the Husseini clan, Hajj Amin especially. But the British don't just make this kind of one-off payment. They're not trying to necessarily weigh heavily for the Arabs only or exclusively. They are in it to do what helps the British. They do not allow locals to take over the railroad or the post office until the British leave, kind of creating chaos and a power vacuum into which perhaps maybe Abdullah might be able to step. So these institutions that are so core to the functioning of normal society, they almost stop working until the British finally leave in May 1948. More importantly, as the military situation deteriorates, as we get into this moment of civil war, the British are still there. The British still have troops on the ground. They still have armored cars. They still have the most modern or effective military. In some cases, the British will intervene to break up the fighting. In other cases, they won't. They tend to be very inconsistent. And, we're talking here about, what is the British position on Israel-Palestine? In reality, British or Britons, individual Britons have very different feelings about it. Local commanders who feel very strongly about Zionism, many of whom are Christians and they believe in the idea of Zionism because they're Christian Zionists, they will try to help the Jews out where they can. Some of them are very anti-Jewish. Some of them are sort of pro-Arab. Some of them just don't like Jews. Some of them kind of favor realpolitik, so we're going to favor the Arabs because it's what Britain needs at the moment. But so you have these instances where one side will receive advanced warning. The British occupy some important police station. They have some important checkpoint. Okay, we're going to be leaving at 4 o'clock this afternoon. And so your side is ready to pounce on that, to get in there, right? We're going to be abandoning this airfield. We're not taking everything with us. Just lug all the gasoline around just for the sake of lugging it, or the ammunition or the bullets or the bombs or whatever. And so militants from either side who are tipped off capture that, occupy those areas, take over, etc. Of course, when you read the literature, a lot of people talk about this as, well, okay, the other side got to take it over. The British were on the other side's team. The British favored the other side. It's not a lot of recognition that, okay, this happens on both sides. The end result of the British position is, again, it's to create a power vacuum. It's going to inhibit the peaceful transfer of power. It's going to inhibit those moments where people can sit down and negotiate what should the post office look like after partition happens. So we have this power vacuum going on inside as people are trying to figure out, okay, what's going to happen? Are there really going to be two states? Are we going back to the negotiating table? What does this mean for the future of Jews and Muslims and Christians living in Palestine? But as these questions are being asked, as people living in mandatory Palestine are trying to negotiate at a very basic level, what the hell does all this mean? In late November and early December 1947, that violence that some Arab leaders had forecast or promised in other parts of the Middle East against Jews, that does begin to take place. In many countries, you have large demonstrations that break out, and in some cases, they transition into modern-day pogroms. In the Yemeni city of Aden, 3 days of rioting after the passage of the UN partition resolution leaves 75 Jews dead, 78 Jews wounded, and dozens of homes, shops, and synagogues are burned to the ground. In Aleppo, Syria, the town's Jewish-owned houses and synagogues were also burned. 3,000 Jewish Syrians fled to the more tolerant city of Beirut, which is in Lebanon. Now, broadly speaking, these were the first shots fired in the ethnic cleansing, as I mentioned before in our previous episode, of the ethnic cleansing of most of the Jewish communities in the Middle East. And it illustrates one of the themes that I'll return to in a moment, which is that in this process, local people's experiences are often determined by outside political forces that are beyond their control, and even in some cases that they don't necessarily agree with. To put this another way, Middle Eastern Jews paid the price for the decisions made by men like David Ben-Gurion of Israel and Haj Amin of the sort of Palestinian side, and more broadly the Husseini family, Jamal al-Husseini, others going on there as well. Their feelings on Zionism, Palestinian nationalism, the place of Jews in the Palestinian society, their feelings get overridden or overtaken by the force of events. Now, these strands or tensions that we've been talking about over the course of several episodes now come together in what becomes known as the Israeli-Palestinian Civil War, which begins almost immediately after the UN vote. And again, what's really tragic about this is that, as I mentioned, this civil war does not necessarily have to happen. Regardless of what the politicians were saying about this idea of throwing people into the sea and rivers of blood and all this, the people on the ground, most ordinary people, just wanted to live their lives. Maybe they didn't like the idea of partition. Maybe they didn't like the idea of the proportions of it, the final agreement. But most of them were willing to try to wait and try to work something out. The civil war that takes place is not the result of some kind of deliberation where either the Jewish or the Palestinian community said, let's think about this. What do we want? Yes, we do want civil war. It is not analogous to the American Civil War, where basically, okay, Lincoln gets elected and people are upset about it. And okay, people in South Carolina are going to meet. They're going to talk about secession. Okay, they're going to vote. Okay, they decide on secession. Right. In that instance, there's a very conscious progression. When you look at the case of Yugoslavia and the breakup of Yugoslavia, a lot of it is, okay, we know we're going to, vote on this referendum for independence. We know that we are taking a step here towards breaking apart or potentially even to civil war. The Israeli-Arab Civil War, Israeli-Palestinian Civil War of 1947-48 is not the result of a conscious plan. There isn't a decision that any one particular political leader makes that says, okay, guys, now we're going. Now it's civil war. As I said again, these events just kind of overwhelm people. They overtake people, and they create a kind of momentum or an inertia of their own that leads to violence. Just again, to talk about the context too, the British are not gone in November 1947. The British are still there. So even had a David Ben-Gurion, even had a Haj Amin, even had someone else wanted to directly intervene, these people are having to make their decisions around the question of what is possible because of what the British might do. So in many ways, then, it's not surprising that, again, these events overtake the major political players by surprise rather than vice versa. Now, when I'm talking about these events, at the heart of them are a series of sporadic acts of violence between the two communities. We're talking about something like a sniper here, a bomb planted there. And these acts of violence begin to convince members of both groups that the other side really desires war, and that as a result, self-defense necessitates one's own turn towards violence. To give you a clearer sense of what this picture looks like on the ground, consider that officially, the Arab Higher Committee's reaction to the UN vote was to call for a 3-day general strike starting on December 2nd. This reaction was not traditional. It's not like they did this all the time, but it had echoes of the 1936 Arab Revolt. This was the way the Arab Revolt starts in 1936 with this idea of a general strike or a boycott. The idea here, one could argue, was to open some space for negating the resolution, for going back to the bargaining table, for some kind of diplomacy, right? So it's not a declaration of war to say we're having a general strike. But this more kind of moderated idea of general strike is again soon overtaken by more violence. On the morning of November 30th, just hours after the partition vote, an 8-man commando team, led by a guy named Saif al-Din Abu Kisk, ambushes a Jewish bus on the coastal plain near Kfar Sirkin, killing 5 Jews. Now, it appears in retrospect that the raid had actually been planned before the UN vote. Right? Not everybody is basing their decisions on what the UN thinks, a lot of it's local circumstances, and especially this idea of retaliation. These people attacked us, therefore we will respond by attacking them. Although usually when we choose the them, it's not directly the people that just attacked us, it's an adjacent group. And we see this running even to the current moment in the Middle East, right? This idea of reprisal attacks and how they kind of propel additional violence. So this killing of the people on the bus was a retaliatory killing for an attack carried out by the Lehi, who you'll remember was a Jewish terrorist group. And the Lehi had undertaken their violence because they had incorrectly suspected a local Arab family of informing on them. So reprisal begets reprisal begets reprisal. But in the context of the UN vote happening right afterwards, when a lot of Jews look at, oh, okay, these people on the bus were killed, they don't see it as retaliation for what the Lehi is doing. They attach its significance to the UN partition vote, and they say, this is Arabs clearly saying, like their politicians were saying all along, that it would be met with violence, and so now we're into this kind of existential situation. Additional acts of violence in the days and weeks after the passage of Resolution 181 play a similar role, feeding this narrative of conflict. In major cities such as Jaffa or Jerusalem, individual Arab snipers will fire at Jewish civilians. In Jerusalem specifically, shortly after the passage of the UN resolution, a large Arab mob formed and basically begins attacking Jewish shops in the city. As we saw outside of Palestine, there are several shops that are set on fire, several that are destroyed. And of course, this is not just one-sided. As these events transpire, and probably in a few places in anticipation of them, members of the Haganah, which is the main defensive militia of the Jewish community in Palestine, members of the Haganah will fire on Arabs, including those who are not participating in the riots. They will snipe and shoot and add to the violence. More radical groups like the Etzel and the Lehi, they also engage in terroristic violence against Arabs, bombing, shooting, killing. One of the more frustrating aspects of the history, especially in this early period of the Civil War, is that a lot of people haven't declared sides. There's no sign or declaration saying, okay, now we are officially at civil war. The British are still there too. The British are supposed to clamp down on all this. Sometimes they do clamp down on it. Sometimes they don't. But as the process played out, the people who think violence is the answer or who are ready for civil war will often attack people who are not in the violent camp yet. But once the violence is done to me, once someone I care about is attacked or my shop is burned, then I get really angry and I want revenge or justice, as I probably think of it. And now I will turn to violence or support violence. And so again, this creates this inertia, this creates this kind of like increasing commitment over the course of several weeks towards civil war. In Jerusalem, for example, a bomb attack on December 29th led Jewish officials to stop working in the city's municipal office because they feared for their safety. That doesn't seem irrational on the surface. But what do Arabs think about that? You work in the municipal office. You're used to having Jewish colleagues, British colleagues, right? You're very kind of cosmopolitan, as we would think today. All of a sudden, all the Jews stop showing up. Does that mean something's up? Do they know something about what might happen? Should we trust them? Can we trust them? If you lived through 9/11, you know that one of the kind of conspiracy theories is that all of a sudden, several thousand Jews just didn't go to work that day because it was an inside job and they knew what was going on. I lived in New York during that period. I am Jewish. Nobody knew of that. There is no truth to this idea that thousands of Jews just didn't go. People that were in the Jewish community died. Also, people in the Muslim community died, and that also gets left out sometimes. But violence spreads fear, spreads anxiety, spreads mistrust. As Yoda tells us, of course, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate. And so this community that may not have been as divided in terms of ideology and identity as the rhetoric and the language of the political leaders makes you think, those divisions get brought home and realized as violence spreads. By the end of 1947, one could argue that there is a pretty clear civil war going on between the Jewish and Arab community in Palestine. Now, as this process plays out, geography is obviously going to be pretty fundamentally important. The people that are experiencing the violence in a place like Jerusalem or in certain neighborhoods in Jerusalem, they are going to really get sort of wise to what's going on very quickly. Their identities are going to get radicalized very quickly. But what if you live in other areas? What if you live in a rural area? What if you live in what is today the West Bank, which is supposed to be part of what will become the Palestinian state, or what was supposed to become the Palestinian state, what is overwhelmingly Arab, very homogenous, not many Jews in this area. And so the conflict plays out at a very civic level. You don't have a clear geography to it. There are not armies or pitched battles as one would think about today. There are a lot of militias that are involved in the fighting. So the Haganah does exist. But they don't all get together and say, okay, we're going to go march against this territory. Here's this coordinated operation of several thousand soldiers. Right? The British are still there. The British still have an army. The British still have airplanes and tanks and things like that. So it's not a war in the sense of a traditional war where it's easy to kind of follow the battle lines, where it's a clear sense of this is one side's territory and that's another side's territory. Instead, what you have are paramilitary units, loose organizations, individuals, and they carry out attacks when and where they are possible. By the start of 1948, this begins to change slowly as the British begin to withdraw more and more forces. But even then, it still remains very regionally specific in the early months of 1948. Almost all of the conflict before March 1948 occurs within the region that is designated to be part of the new Jewish state. There is almost no fighting in what we would think of today as the West Bank, which again is supposed to be part of the Palestinian side. One of the consequences of this is if you are an Arab, if you're a Palestinian, you're living in the West Bank, you read in the newspaper, okay, there was a bombing, there was some violence. It doesn't carry the same weight and the same kind of like importance to you as it does to the Arabs that are directly, or the Palestinians that are directly experiencing it because their shop got attacked. People living on the West Bank are not as aware that they are living in a civil war as people living on the sort of more, again, the area earmarked for the Jewish side. Violence was not something, as we've talked about, violence was not something that was new. There were these sporadic examples in 1920, in 1921, in 1929, of especially anti-Jewish violence. So the idea that a lot of people, especially, again, Palestinians living away from where the Jewish state is, but also Jews living in the Jewish state, aside from mixed areas, and even some living in mixed areas. The idea that a lot of people have is this is some violence, but it will pass because it has always passed before. Now, in this initial phase of the fighting, The conflict is difficult to determine the strengths of who is where and what strengths do they have. On the one hand, one could argue that the delayed start to the war really, really helps the Zionists. And this is because the Zionists, as we've seen, as we've talked about in a lot of detail, the Zionists have already built a significant political and social structure or infrastructure that is capable of mobilizing Jewish society. Mostly speaking, Jewish society in Palestine itself, but also the diasporic Jewish community. Zionism, by this point, had created a highly organized, bureaucratically efficient set of institutions. Think of it this way. You have a whole generation of Jews growing up in Palestine who are fully invested in the ideals of Jewish nationalism. It's not just that they read about, in Herzl or they read about it in somebody else in a book and they, this theory, okay. These are kids that have grown up on kibbutzim, in Jewish schools, and they've been hearing about Jewish nationalism their whole lives. They feel a clear sense of purpose and identity and a mission as to what the meaning of creating a Jewish state is for them. And so again, when this moment comes, Zionist leadership is able to fully mobilize Palestinian Jewish society in service of the war effort. They actually were in the process, as the civil war breaks out, they're actually in the process of reorganizing the Haganah into an actual army structure. Because they know or they expect that there is war coming, and they want the Haganah to essentially become a modern army. And so they start doing all the things like specialization, they create hierarchies, they create, more importantly, ideas of communication. How do we coordinate between the various branches, between the various units in the army? They have a general staff to kind of plan out, okay, if war breaks out, what are some of the things we can do? What are some of our strategies that we're going to think about? And again, as I mentioned, they also have the Jewish diaspora that they can appeal to. One of the names that we have not mentioned very much in the podcast was a woman named Golda Meyerson. Golda Meyerson was from Wisconsin. She moved to Israel to help kind of build, again, the idea of the issue of the Jewish state. When war breaks out in 1947, they send Golda Meir, as she becomes known, they send Golda Meir back to the United States on 2 different tours, and she raises over $100 million for the Zionist war effort. $100 million that can be used to purchase illegal weaponry, bullets, guns, artillery, mortars, airplanes. The Palestinians, by contrast, had not developed this same kind of institutional capacity. Whereas the different Zionist factions, at the end of 1945, the Lehi, the Etzel, and the Haganah, they come together at the start of the Jewish revolt. They say, look, we've fought against each other, actually in 1945 as well, but we're going to end our kind of internal struggles because we need to be unified. This is the moment that we've all kind of waited for. Maybe we thought there were different roads to get there, but this is the time that we need to unite. On the Palestinian side, these different Palestinian factions, I mentioned the Nashashibis, the Husseinis, there's others as well, they had gone to war with each other in 1936 to 1939. Some of the most capable Palestinian leaders were eliminated, not by Israelis, but by Palestinians. In addition, Palestinian society had not been disrupted and reborn in the same way that many of the immigrant Jewish ones had. When you think of these Jewish immigrants coming from Poland, coming from Russia, coming later on from Germany, right? They show up in Israel or in Palestine, and they have no other identity. Yes, you can say I'm a Russian Jew, I'm a Polish Jew, whatever, but doesn't really mean much. They're not reconstituting Polish Jewish society. They're constituting or trying to create a Jewish society. There's a whole process of reshaping identities and loyalties that happens because of the disruption in Europe. Palestinians until 1948 hadn't been through any of this. Palestinians still had their local loyalties to family, to clan, to village. those loyalties that in many ways had existed for hundreds of years, and that in many ways are stronger or more important or more relevant to your ordinary Palestinian than this idea of nationality. Nationalism, and this is true in Europe as well, going back into the 19th century, nationalism has always been very, very popular in literate classes, in the middle class. Eventually, kind of wealthier people get involved in it, like it. Urbanites like it. What does nationalism mean to a farmer who, if their field doesn't get plowed, they might suffer through drought and they might die? Now, it comes to mean something to them, but the process is much slower. The disintegration of Palestinian society hadn't happened yet, and so as a result, it hadn't been steeled in some ways to this idea of how important the national identity was. We talked about in our last episode how Palestinians had tried to develop military organizations similar to the Haganah. We talked about the Najada. We talked about the Futuha. But neither is as developed or sophisticated in terms of arms and training by late 1947 as the Haganah had been. The Haganah had been built on several predecessors, some of which included Jews fighting with the British Army in a specifically Jewish unit during World War I. It had been built out of Jews who had served alongside the British during the Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939. It's not a cultural difference. It's just a difference of circumstance and experience. Palestinian infighting also plays a role in this story. The leader of the Najada was Muhammad Nimr al-Hawari. What happens to Muhammad? Well, he leaves in late 1947, the precise moment when having a Palestinian militia was pretty important and having its leadership would be pretty important. Al-Hawari flees to go to Jordan because the Husseinis, at least he thought, the Husseinis were after him to try to assassinate him. The Palestinians in general do a very poor job of coordinating within their own community and also with other Arab states because there are still a lot of these local rivalries and jealousies and things like that that prohibit them from working well together. We've mentioned Haj Amin's name a couple times. Haj Amin still wants to be the main leader of Palestine after this sort of situation is resolved. He is very worried about what might happen if, later on we'll talk about Fawzi al-Quwqchi again, but what happens if other Palestinians take on a leadership role? So as they're making these decisions, they're not just focused on Israeli versus Palestinian, but the Palestinian side is fractured and in some ways is fighting with itself. Finally, there is also a wide gap in terms of motivational factors for the Zionist. If you think about this moment of crisis in 1947-48 and how many Jews living in Palestine perceived it, you obviously have the legacy of the Holocaust right there. And the Holocaust is not some distant event that happened that your granddad told you about or it happened 40, 50 years ago. The Holocaust at this point is 2 to 3 years old. The decisions, the perceptions, the effects from something that is so recent in your memory is going to make the importance of the moment, the need for you to dedicate yourself to the cause, very clear and very obvious very quickly. To many Jews, 1947-48 is the decisive moment in Jewish history, when either they are going to forge the nation through violence or they are going to suffer a second Holocaust. Palestinians, on the other hand, do not share this sense of immediacy. There isn't, for many of them, an awareness or a foreboding, a sort of sense, a perception of what the stakes are in this civil war. To many ordinary Palestinians, especially those who live away from the areas of heavy fighting, it just, you don't get why it's so important. One of the things that happens on the ground is that in sort of many mixed areas, you have Palestinian villages and Jewish villages that get together and sign essentially non-aggression pacts. Maybe they don't sign a formal treaty, but they get together. They say, okay, look, we won't attack you. You don't attack us. You don't let the Lehi come and base themselves out of your village. we're not going to let various Palestinian militias come and base themselves out of our village. We're going to stay out of it. We're going to live our lives. And so these communities basically elect not to participate in the war. Unfortunately, what begins to happen, to give away some of the story, is that national political leadership will begin to assert authority or control, will override the desires of local Jewish villages, in many cases, to have those non-aggression pacts. It doesn't matter what the Palestinian villagers actually did to people like Ben-Gurion as they start setting about creating the state of Israel, especially after March 1948. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let me back up just a second. Basically, as this realization of war spreads in December 1947, Palestinians are not able to take military advantage of the situation. Instead of forming like a large army, they organize into small bands of 200 to 500 fighters led by a local commander. They move around various territories. They augment their cohorts temporarily with local fighters from neighboring villages. Not all villages decide to participate. As I mentioned, there's some that do these non-aggression pacts, but many do. But they're not in for the whole, dedication to the civil war. This is the moment. Either Palestine's going to exist or it's not. They say, okay, you're going to go attack those people over there. Yeah, you can borrow some of the armed men from the village. They'll help you out a little bit. And then once the battle is over or the fighting's over, they come back to the village. They don't stay as part of an army. So these villages will have 10 to 100 people as part of a kind of militia, but the militia isn't really interested in anything beyond the immediate geographic context. These militias tend to be lightly armed. They might have a mortar or two, they might have a machine gun or two, but for the most case, it's rifles, it's a couple pistols. Now, in terms of their fighting capability, these militiamen are tenacious, they often fight courageously, but they really don't have large numbers. They can't apply force in the same way that a normal army would. You also have major issues with coordination. How do you coordinate between all these small bands of independent villagers who are making decisions based on what they perceive, but are not trying to kind of coordinate things? So you attack in the north, I'll attack in the south, they'll attack in the east. You don't get that type of coordination that you see the Haganah having along with the Lehi and the Etzel. In addition, as I said, for a lot of Arabs or a lot of Palestinians living in the territories, especially at the very start of the Civil War, they don't understand the significance of it or the consequences of it, or they're not interested in it. And so when these bands of fighters come along, in many cases, they don't want to help them. Why do I want to risk my life for your war? I don't care about it. Why do I want to give you my food or my money? I don't have a lot of it to begin with. So sometimes, again, these villages don't want to fight. Sometimes they have secret agreements with nearby Jewish villages. But Palestinian society as a whole does not mobilize behind the cause in the same way that the Jewish community does behind the Yishuv. The only thing that's kind of close to an exception to this is the creation of the more organized Arab Liberation Army, which basically is formed from Syrian volunteers. Now, there's volunteers from all over the Middle East. There's a lot of history to this. Basically, the Syrians don't want to be the ones who are sticking their necks out, so to speak. They're not very confident in their own army, especially in the winter of 1947. And so basically they will say, let's set up a volunteer army. We can give it money. We can give it funding. The Egyptians will help out, obviously Syrians, Iraqis, etc. So they basically create this several thousand-man army in October of 1947. This army, because it's volunteers, can go into Palestine before the British leave. They don't have to wait and risk pissing off the British. By November of 1947, they had created this Arab Liberation Army, or the ALA, and they picked our old friend Fawzi al-Quwqji to run or to command it. Now, Quwqji was a veteran Ottoman officer. He had been singled out as one of the most effective commanders during the Arab Revolt in 1936. He spent part of World War II in Iraq, helping to lead a pro-Axis coup in Iraq, along with Haj Amin. The two of them both went to Germany, although they had a falling out together. But Quwqji was considered a pretty serious commander, a pretty effective military leader. And so basically in January 1948, the lead elements of this Arab Liberation Army, about 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers will cross into the territory of Palestine from Syria. However, all of these Palestinian forces basically suffer from supply and command problems. Again, the institutional advantages the Yishuv gets, not because of the British or because of the global community or something like that, but because they had just kind of coordinated everything. They had built institutions, they had command structures, they coordinate a lot of what they're doing. They have such an incredible advantage. Where are all of these village militias going to get their weapons from? Where are they getting extra gasoline, extra ammunition? They don't have a centralized, coordinated body really carrying this out, or at least not carrying it out effectively. What they rely on are donations from the individual Arab states, which sounds great on paper, but these states themselves do not have sophisticated militaries yet. They give the Palestinians some munitions, some weapons. But if I just handed you a box full of random bullets, they don't all work in the same gun. Bullets come in different calibers. They come in different qualities. Some rifles don't fire as effectively as others. So basically what you see from the Palestinian side as the civil war kind of begins to get this inertia is a lot of ad hoc local decisions, a lot of a kind of improvisation. There isn't a clear plan on what to do, and they don't have the institutional capacity to kind of create the forces that are going to win the war. So basically, again, they have their local militias, and then you break up into several larger contingents of several hundred, and in some cases, a couple thousand soldiers, and they have like a kind of regional military commander. Perhaps one of the most talented commanders was a member of the al-Husseini family. This was Abd al-Qadir. He was in charge of the area kind of around Jerusalem, so the central part of Palestine. But al-Qadir is actually killed, as we'll see, in early April 1948 at the start of kind of the offensive phase of the civil war. And so the Palestinian commanders, they are never able to make the Palestinian military equal the sum of all its parts. Right? It's fractured into too many different commands, too many different units. And even though they kind of have the initiative really until March of 1948, they are not able to take advantage of it to win the war. To focus a little bit more on the Yishuv and the Jewish side of things, for the opening months of the Civil War, we're talking about December to February 1948, there is very little movement in terms of boundaries from Zionist forces. Generally speaking, when we're talking about the policy of what becomes the Israeli military, the idea here is to hold on to territory, to pursue a policy of defense, or to control territory where you already have large numbers of Jews living. In practice, this idea of defense deserves an asterisk, because defense does not mean passivity. The Jewish forces, as the Civil War begins, do not just sit around and say, okay, we're going to try to protect this village, we're going to try to protect this quarter of the town where a lot of Jews are living. After December 9th, 1947, the Yishuv forces adopted a policy of what they call active retaliation. In other words, their idea is we want to keep most of the Palestinian population sort of on the sidelines. This isn't yet full-on, full-blown civil war. And so what we want to do is discourage people from attacking Jews and Jewish settlements. If you live in a village and someone from your village comes and attacks a Jewish area, we are going to retaliate with violence. Maybe even disproportional violence so that you learn, and more importantly, perhaps neighboring villages warn, don't give support to those bands of fighters that are coming in from other parts of Palestine. Haganah units, even though they're on the defensive, will enter Muslim villages, will enter Christian villages, often at night, and they will distribute leaflets warning the villagers that if you support, for example, the Arab Liberation Army, there will be violent consequences for your village. On December 18th, 1947, the Haganah entered one such village known as al-Hisas, near the Lebanese border, to conduct one of these sort of combined retaliatory intimidation operations. In other words, the idea is not just that we're going to go and drop leaflets here, but there was an attack in the nearby area. We want to dissuade the kind of local population from getting involved. And so we are going to carry violence to them in a kind of mafia way of sending a message. Don't get involved. The backstory here is that 2.5 weeks earlier on December 2nd, several Arabs had attacked a Jewish guard buying cigarettes. Later that day, there were some shots fired at Jewish workers in a nearby field. And on December 18th, a Jewish cart driver was ambushed and shot. And so as a result, the local Palmach commander, the Palmach were kind of special squads from the Haganah, the local Palmach commander requests permission to carry out reprisal attacks. These reprisal attacks are not just demonstrations or shows of violence as a way of, firing a gunshot into the air, leave us alone. It is more like we are going to kill someone from your group to send a message that if you don't stop, we're going to kill everybody or even more people. Now, the local civilian Jewish commander in this area opposed this idea of a retaliatory attack because he said, actually the area is relatively peaceful. Jews and Arabs in this area actually get along pretty well. Let's not stir the pot. Let's not make things worse. But the regional Palmach commander, a guy named Yigal Allon, whose name we'll meet again and again in the history of the Israeli military, Yigal Allon wants to punish these villagers and wants to carry out punitive killings. On the night of December 18th, therefore, Palmach units entered the village. They lay explosives on several houses. These are mostly people that they suspect were involved in Palestinian resistance, were involved in carrying out some of those attacks that I mentioned. This is like the middle of the night. They lay explosives and they destroy them without warning. Of course, if you blow up a building with a combatant in it, with a fighter in it, but the guy has a family, you don't allow the family warning, you will also kill his family. And this is obviously a problem going on right now with the war in Gaza, right? Where the idea that, you can't kill civilians, so if you can't just kill your military target, then you don't fire, which is probably the kind of more normal course of warfare. The Israeli perspective is you kill who you have to kill, and if there are collateral damages, then that's their problem. And so 10 to 15 villagers in this little village of Al-Hisas are killed. Now, at this point, this type of violence was still exceptional. This actually is a scandal. David Ben-Gurion will deny that the raid has been authorized, and he actually issues a formal apology. Of course, as happens in these cases, no one is ever punished for the attack on Al-Hisas, and later on, the Yishuv will kind of look at this as being a successful military operation. Another early massacre that fits a similar pattern that we need to talk about occurs at the village of Balad al-Sheik on December 31st, 1947, just outside of Haifa. And again, it's worth going into detail for several reasons, one of which, when we talk about the Nakba, when we talk about these big events, we talk about hundreds of thousands of people being expelled, sometimes it's hard to understand what that means, right? It's just a number, it's a large number, but what does that mean for actual people surviving it, living through it? And so I want to go into a little bit of detail about some of these incidents from the Nakba because it humanizes it, and we need to do that. I think it also illustrates the ways in which, again, these small acts of violence in the early days of the Civil War basically boomerang or ping-pong back and forth between the two communities. Small acts of violence radicalize the situation and eventually lead to atrocity. Historically speaking, resistance movements tend to like the idea of these small acts of violence or targeted acts of violence, even against civilians, because the idea is that you turn the temperature up, you get the other side to overreact, and you force people to choose sides. Of course, what they often leave out or don't seem to realize is that this leads to atrocity. So, for example, on December 2nd, 1947, this is just a handful of days after the UN partition resolution. This is just immediately the very beginning of the Civil War. You have some shots fired at a bus station that is bringing cement workers to a nearby factory. 6 days later, on December 8th, a car was attacked, leaving a kibbutz in the area when it encounters an impromptu Arab roadblock. 2 days later, in response, Jewish police fire at one of these kind of impromptu barricades. So, you have these limited kind of episodes of violence. It's not clear if we're headed towards civil war. It's not really clear what any of this means. But the Irgun decide that with these events in the background, this is an opportunity to show Arabs Jewish mettle, to show Arabs that they can't do violence against Jews. We're going to show them. We're going to provoke them a little bit, maybe turn up the temperature and push us more towards civil war. Members of the Irgun decide to retaliate, and they throw grenades into a crowd of Arab workers in front of the Iraqi petroleum refinery in Haifa. Now, these are working class guys. They're in an urban environment. They work alongside Jewish workers in many cases. This is a fairly cosmopolitan place, this Haifa, Iraqi petroleum refinery in Haifa. But throwing grenades into a bunch of Arab workers, killing some of them, wounding dozens of them, obviously pisses a lot of them off. They get angry. Surviving workers and members of the local Arab community respond by attacking Jewish workers. They will kill 39 Jews. They will wound 49 more. This then transforms the conflict from one between the Irgun and the local workers, or even before that, between whatever people were involved in these initial attacks. This raises the eyes of the Palmach. We can't, whether the Lehi was responsible for prompting this or not, we can't let dozens of Jews be killed. We now have to show these Palestinians, these Arabs, who's in charge. And so the Palmach will organize a special raid on the nearby village of Balad al-Sheik. Now, Balad al-Sheik is not just a random village on the outskirts of Haifa. It also happens to be the burial site of Izz al-Din al-Qassam, the spiritual founder of Hamas. We talked quite a bit about al-Qassam on our episode about the Mandate period. If you go back and you listen to the History Off the Page episode on the British Mandate, you can find all about al-Qassam. Hamas has named their rockets after al-Qassam. They've named some of their brigades after al-Qassam. He's not just a minor player in the story of Hamas, even though he doesn't found Hamas. That doesn't come till the 1980s. Intellectually, spiritually, he is one of the original kind of maximalists for Palestinian resistance. And he happens to be buried in Balad al-Sheik. On the night of December 31st, 170 Palmach troops surround the village with orders to, quote, kill as many men as possible. They are told not to kill women and children. Somehow this is sort of civilized in some way. This is the way they imagine it. But men become targets because any man with a gun can become a fighter. And so they are told preventatively, preactively, to send a messagely, go in and kill as many men as possible. Don't worry about whether they're actually innocent. I'm adding the don't worry about if they're innocent or not because it's implied. The attackers moved into the village late at night. They proceed house by house. They pull out men and they execute them immediately on the spot. Occasionally, they save themselves the trouble. They just throw a grenade into a house and they kill anyone present, including women and children. We don't actually know how many Palestinians were killed in this raid. It was probably several dozen, and it certainly included women and children. There were a few Jewish leaders at the time who responded by criticizing the actions, who said it went too far. But unlike al-Qissas, this time Ben-Gurion defends the killings privately. He says these are justifiable. We're in a kind of existential war here. We can't afford to take the time to figure out who's guilty and innocent. I'm paraphrasing. That's not a direct quote. But that's the mindset, right? This idea of it's an existential crisis, these boundaries, these moral norms, they don't matter anymore because if we lose, then we're going to see a second Holocaust. Over the course of time, Zionist leaders increasingly approved wider uses of violence in order to win the civil war. Eventually, of course, this will culminate in the kind of bulk of what we think of as the Nakba, which will be the forced expulsion of Palestinians living in areas designated for the Jewish state. Before 1948, these expulsions are relatively rare. So rare, in fact, that the villagers living in Balad al-Sheik, most of them don't leave. Even after this night raid, even after these executions, a lot of them stay until May of 1948. The first forced expulsion, that is directly planned as an expulsion, occurs in mid-February 1948. It targets 5 Palestinian villages that are viewed as bases for Arab fighters. The decision is not made because of ideological reasons. It's not made because of racism, although obviously these things can be a factor in them. The principal reason is military. There are a number of sort of Jewish villages that are kind of in more rural areas, or they have basically Arab villages that are lying alongside the roads. And as the war progresses, Arab villagers will snipe from these roads. They will carry out attacks from these roads or upon these roads. And so basically you isolate some of these Jewish communities. So in mid-February, the idea is we are going to send a message, either allow our troops and our food, especially, and water and gasoline to get through to these Jewish settlements, or we will destroy you. This is how David Ben-Gurion understood what was going on in February, according to his own diary. The idea was use a show of force. This show of force will then dissuade other villages from supporting the Palestinian cause and will enable us to win the civil war and keep those Jewish communities alive that are not contiguous with the rest of the Yishuv. This is not yet what I would describe as the formal campaign of ethnic cleansing, but I would also argue that this is an important step on the road there. One of the first instances of these operations happens on February 5th. Jewish forces are ordered to occupy the village of Caesarea, which is an Arab settlement on top of the former Roman city of Caesarea. They were also ordered to expel the local Palestinian population and then further to destroy the houses so that the villagers cannot return. These orders were then carried out 10 days later, and the demolition teams followed up on February 20th. A similar attack took place on the village of Sasa, where Jewish sappers blew up houses without warning, killing several Palestinian families. Now, the attacks we've just discussed, as well as those in December 1947, are still, for the most part, the exception to the rule. They were not yet the formal or intentional start of the ethnic cleansing campaign that we kind of hinted at or discussed a little bit in the introduction. But their effects were similar. As violence spread, those who were able to leave, especially wealthier Palestinians in mixed areas, left for safer places like the West Bank, Lebanon, or Egypt. By the end of 1947, we are talking about 75,000 people. And importantly, these people that are leaving are, for the most part, not the felahin, basically the farmers, not the grunts, not the ordinary people working the land, the small merchants, things like that. These are wealthier Palestinians. These are Palestinians with education, with means. These are people that should be in leadership. These are the people that when a crisis hits, you want them thinking about how do we respond? How do we organize? How do we run finances? But many of them are already leaving by the end of 1947. And this will become a problem, especially for Palestinians, as Palestinian society tries to cope with this civil war that they didn't necessarily see coming. Some of their people that they need to deal with that are not there on the ground. It also will evolve into a strategy for winning not just the civil war, but especially the first Arab-Israeli war that's on the horizon. Ethnic cleansing becomes a weapon of war. And we'll see that take place after March of 1948. Let me backtrack just a little bit and go over the Arab actions or what Arabs are doing during this period of war. For the most part, as I mentioned, they tend to be very disjointed. They're unorganized. But there are some more formal offensives. One of the first major, what we might call Palestinian offensives in the war, happens on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, December 8th, 1947. There is some sporadic shooting between the two sides. The British decide to show up and kind of intervene. Once he departs, the local Palestinian commander Hassan Salameh gets together several hundred irregular soldiers under his command, and they assault the Hatikva quarter of Tel Aviv, briefly capturing part of it and setting several houses on fire. Additional acts proceed against some small Jewish villages in December 1947, although for the most part they tend to be fairly ineffective. On January 9th, members of the Arab Liberation Army will enter Palestine for the first time. Some will take up defensive positions in various Arab towns and villages, while others will carry out offensive operations against Jewish settlements such as Kefar Sold and Kefar Etzion. Here, as we saw just a moment ago, the distinction between civilian areas and military combatants often becomes blurred. Any man of military age could theoretically become a combatant the moment that they picked up a gun. They could easily hide the gun, and so this is one of the reasons that both sides do this. The Jewish side tends to be more on the offensive, so they have more opportunities to do this, but they look at people that are of military age, men, whether or not they have a gun, as suspect. This leads to atrocities where they will kill unarmed men. Just on the suspicion that, well, you're an unarmed man, theoretically you could have hidden something here. That's enough to warrant a death sentence. At any rate, rather than conquest, by far the more effective Arab response, as I mentioned, tends to be to shut down the transportation links between Jewish communities, especially those in rural areas and the main body of the Yishuv. To carry out kind of guerrilla attacks to shut down a transportation highway, as we saw in the Iraq War recently in the 21st century, you don't need, really coordinated command and control. You don't need heavy weapons. You can attack from the position of strength when and where you want. You can lay bombs at night. And so this becomes the most successful area of Arab military operations up till March 1948. The most significant achievement in the war, especially in the early months, is that the Arabs basically shut down the highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. This is the main supply link to the city of Jerusalem, or at least to the Jewish area of Jerusalem in this moment of civil war. Finally, it's worth mentioning that both sides will turn to terrorism as a way of carrying out the war and, of course, kind of also inspiring and giving inertia to the idea of the conflict as a whole. Both Jewish and Arab nationalists do this. On December 28th, for example, members of the Lehi threw bombs into an Arab cafe in Jerusalem. 1 week later, they detonate a truck bomb in a cafe in Jaffa that kills dozens of Palestinians, including members of the local Palestinian National Committee. Palestinian groups, by contrast, also engaged in retaliatory bombing operations. On February 22nd, for example, a group of British Army deserters and ex-policemen who were Palestinian drive 3 stolen trucks into the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, detonating them next to the Atlantic and Amdursky hotels, which had housed members of the Palmach. The explosion ends up leveling 4 buildings, kills 58 people, the majority of which were civilians. Another attack on February 1st targets the office of the Palestine Post, which basically becomes the Jerusalem Post today, and kills 4 people there. By the end of 1948, 400 Jewish civilians had died in the fighting, 1,500 Palestinians. Those figures would obviously rise over the course of the next 2 months as the civil war intensified. The Yishuv's political and military leaders largely held on to Jewish areas of Palestine, though international support for the partition began to wane. Adding to the pressure of the moment was the looming British withdrawal date of May 15, 1948, which would enable nearby Arab states such as Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to enter the conflict with their professional armies. Finally, the closure of the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road created great anxiety among the Zionist leadership that it could not be held, and that the area of Jewish Jerusalem would fall and would not be a part of the new Jewish state. As a result of all these factors, in early March 1948, David Ben-Gurion and company would adopt a fundamental strategic shift, a choice to go on to what they called the offensive, to begin to create the state of Israel that they desired, rather than simply to defend the state of Israel that the UN had authorized. They therefore set about creating and enacting a plan to ethnically cleanse the Jewish part of Palestine. Known as Plan Balad, it became one of the most crucial events in modern Middle Eastern history. And we'll go into more detail about that in the third part of this podcast. We'll also discuss the Jordanian role in all of this and answer the often unasked question of what happened to the rest of Palestine, the part that the UN had earmarked for a Palestinian state. Why was no Palestine declared on May 15, 1948, the way an Israeli state was declared? But we'll get into all of this next time. For now, I'd like to thank you for listening. Again, if you've found it useful, if you think this is a kind of balanced account that maybe your friends on either side or with sympathies on either side of this conflict now might need to hear, please feel free to recommend us to friends, to family, especially those of you that are on social media. Feel free to just post, say, hey, I found this useful podcast, History Off the Page. Go ahead and throw a link up there for us. We would really appreciate that. That is the number one way that awareness and knowledge about this podcast spreads. And as I've said, I think this is a really important thing. One of the really hard aspects of the current crisis and the history that underlies the current crisis is that it's very hard for people to see the history of the other side, right? Of the side that I'm not feeling sympathy for. And so I hope that this has helped you gain some understanding for the decisions that were made. I hope this helps you understand how people can come to commit atrocities. And we'll obviously explore this theme more in the third part of this episode on the Nakba. Again, I'd like to thank you so much for listening. Please join us next time as we take history off the page.